Okay, thank you everyone, and welcome to this discussion on the recently agreed India-EU FTA. I think this is going to be a very timely and exciting discussion, and I'm particularly pleased that it's being organized jointly by ICRIER and by Bruegel, which is the premier economics think tank in Europe. A discussion like this, I think, really needs both the Indian perspective as well as the European perspective to be complete, just as we need two hands to clap. Now, it would be an understatement to say that these are turbulent times for the global trading system. President Trump's universal and reciprocal tariffs are only the latest iteration of a much wider turn towards protectionism. In fact, if you look at international trade to global output, it's been stagnant at best for the last 15 years. The same is true of foreign direct investment. Industrial policies aimed at favoring domestic firms over foreign firms are finding root on both sides of the Atlantic and also in emerging markets. The number of global trade restrictions imposed in 2024 was 9 times as many as those imposed in 2014, a decade earlier. The WTO's dispute resolution mechanism lies in tatters, and the appellate body lacks the requisite 3 members in order to hear cases. I could go on. Against this somewhat grim backdrop, the EU-India FTA stands out as a beacon of hope for further trade integration. I hope that today we'll get an opportunity to go beyond simply the sectoral benefits for India and EU and delve a bit deeper into the broader context and consequences of this landmark agreement. What does it say about closer integration between the people of India and the EU, a combined 2 billion people, in trade, in technology, in investment, in people-to-people exchanges? What domestic policies are needed on both sides to maximize the benefits of this agreement? And does the future of international trade lie in bilateral agreements like this one? Or in fact, does this deal create the space for a flowering of more multilateral agreements further down the road? We are privileged to have with us today, as our keynote speaker, one of the key architects of the foreign trade agreement. Dr. Sabine Weyand is the Director General for Trade and Economic Security in the European Commission. She's had a distinguished career at the Commission, including serving in the Cabinet of Trade Commissioner Pascal Lamy and the Cabinet of Commission President Barroso. She has been with DG Trade since 2016, covering multilateral trade policy, trade relations with North America and European neighborhood countries, as well as trade defense. One particularly high-profile recent role was to handle the Brexit negotiations under Michel Barnier. Dr. Weyand, we could not have asked for anybody with a more detailed and intimate knowledge of these negotiations and what they mean for both countries. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to address this gathering, and I turn it over to you now for your keynote address.
Thank you very much indeed. Greetings from Brussels, and I'm very happy to be with you, and I have listened carefully to how you have framed the discussion, and I think that is exactly right, because what we've tried to do, the EU and India, is to set a framework that allows both economies to work together for their prosperity and resilience. But filling that framework with life is obviously for the actors on both sides, not just on the political side, but also on the business side, and all this with the help of academia, think tanks, and civil society more large. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity. And I have to say, I'm very proud of the conclusion of these negotiations between India and the EU. Less than 2 months ago, 2 global powers chose to work together, chose stability over instability, predictability over unpredictability, rules-based order over the use of force. And I think that is no mean achievement. We have written history here at a particularly difficult moment for international trade, because we are seeing a dramatic escalation of geopolitical and economic tensions, from the great power competition between the US and China, to the consequences of the COVID pandemic, to various international conflicts, and of course for us in Europe, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. All this contributes to unpredictability and uncertainty, which is of course further driven by the America First trade policy pursued by Washington and the imposition of onerous export control regulations by Beijing. So it is this context that has spurred both sides to put aside long-held positions and decide that now is the time to take a leap of faith and to join forces to manage the international economy. So I think you have a very good panel here. And of course, I will tell you how the story ended, how it started. You have Ignacio García Bercero with you, who is best placed to tell you just how many difficulties we had to overcome in order to get to an outcome. Now, I know you don't want just to focus on the economic benefits, but I'm sorry, we cannot ignore them because it is still one of the key drivers of trade agreements. And the EU-India FTA will bring about massive advantages for businesses on both sides. It's the largest trade agreement that either the EU or India have ever concluded. It creates a market of over 1.8 billion consumers. We already have a sound basis from which to start. Bilateral trade in goods between the EU and India reached almost 120 billion in 2025, despite some very high tariffs still. And trade in services reached a total of 66 billion euros in 2024. So this is a good basis, but one which has still a lot of potential. And that is the aim of our FTA, to create a more open, stable, and predictable environment for Indian and EU businesses to thrive in. Now, in order to bring the negotiations to a successful conclusion, both India and the EU have built on their common ground, but we have also managed to overcome and accommodate diverging approaches which result from our different FTA practices. How could it be otherwise, given the economic profile and the trajectories of the two partners? Our FTA is therefore in some regards unique and certainly a first for both partners. There is a significant tailoring to the needs and constraints of both sides. A superficial comparison with other FTA may thus not convey the full meaning of what we have achieved here. As part of the new agreement, both sides will liberalize significantly. In total, 99% of the value of Indian exports to the EU and 97% of the value of EU exports to India will benefit from this agreement. This is the most extensive trade opening that India has granted to any trade partner, which I think shows the strong ambition on both sides. This mutual reduction of trade barriers is a transformative step forward, poised to invigorate key economic sectors on both sides and drive economic development. Businesses of all sizes will reap the fruits of this landmark agreement. A recent survey by the Federation of European Business in India concluded that close to 80% of EU businesses in India expect additional investment, and around 60% expressed confidence in the possibility to expand operations in India when the FTA is implemented. For small businesses, the removal of barriers to trade and the simplification of procedures will be even more beneficial. For the EU, this FTA is expected to bring strong benefits for industries like agri-food, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, machinery, medical devices, avionics, and automotive. Moreover, we anticipate that this will have a positive impact in India. 82% of EU business in India expects to create direct jobs in India in the 5 years following the entry into force of the agreement. And of course, we have also catered for India's key exporting sectors. In particular, labor-intensive goods was a key priority for the Indian negotiators. So what we see here is an opening up on textiles, shoes, leather goods, and most fisheries products, which are the areas where the EU has comparatively higher tariffs. And here the FTA will lead to the EU front-loading duty-free access to India in support of jobs in India and in support of the diversification of supply for the EU. For passenger cars, we agreed on a balanced but meaningful quotas for both sides and full elimination of tariffs on car parts. So this is something which will promote local production in India and further integrate our supply chains. Parts and other components for machinery or inputs for medicine production will be free of tariffs, enabling optimized and predictable production and supply chain management. Service providers in key areas will gain better market access and enhance the competitiveness of the economy. The protection level afforded to intellectual property thanks to administrative and judicial enforcement procedures in particular, will support innovation on both sides. And I could go on and highlight many more areas, but I think you get the gist of my argument. Now, the agreement, and I think that is what is required in today's world economy, will also make an impact on supply chains more broadly. It will help the EU and India to diversify away from any remaining dependencies to trusted and resilient EU-India supply chains. It will bring together innovative manufacturing capacities for our joint benefit and support the upgrading of technologies and skills. As I mentioned, key areas in this respect are pharmaceuticals, but we are also looking at life sciences more broadly, green technologies such as solar, wind, and electric vehicle supply chains, machinery, precision instruments. I think here we are really setting ourselves up for a win-win partnership that secures prosperity for the future. So all in all, we have delivered a surprisingly ambitious agreement. Even half a year ago, I would not have thought this possible, but we actually managed to do that, we managed to trust each other and open up markets. And this is something which we now have to bring to fruition by getting the agreement actually on our statute books. But that brings me to my final point. And I think that was also mentioned by the chairman in the introduction. The real value of this agreement is not just numbers. It is the fact that India and the EU have established a framework for cooperation and dialogue on which we can build further. So this is a platform for cooperation that goes well beyond tariff dismantling and the dismantling of non-tariff barriers. This opens up the pathway towards a cooperation agenda going forward that will help not just our prosperity, but also our mutual resilience. In this respect, there is one area where I wouldn't call it an area of regret, but where I think we have unfinished business, and that is we have not been able to include a chapter on investment in this agreement. We were very close, but I think India was reticent to signal or to even bind its current level of openness. That is something we had to accept. But in order to reap all the benefits I talked about, the resilience of supply chains, the integration of our supply chains, you cannot just look at trade, you also need to look at investment. And we have agreed in the agreement that we will pick up these negotiations again and take them forward. We also still have a live negotiation going on investment protection. This continues as well. As will the negotiations on the protection of geographical indications. So this is not the finishing point of our trade relationship, it's the starting point of an enhanced partnership. And I also wanted to pay tribute to our Indian counterparts, because as I said, it took both sides to take a leap of faith and to overcome long-established barriers. And I'm very happy that we managed to do that. I will leave it there, and I wish you an excellent discussion with the great panel that you have been able to mobilize. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Weyand. That was a true tour de force. I like the way that you took us through the numbers and what they mean in terms of economics, but I was particularly taken by a couple of words that you used. One was surprisingly ambitious. I think that's a great term for both words because it's surprising given the lack of progress in the past, and it is indeed very ambitious. And then the other term you use, which stays with me, is unfinished business, and the fact that this is the starting point, not the finish line. There's a lot of work we need to do on investment. I would add to that, with investment comes finance, so we need to figure out finance arrangements. And then there's the broader question of people-to-people exchanges, migration, skilled migration, unskilled migration. So there's a lot to delve into. Let me now turn to our brilliant panel. We're very happy to have with us a fantastic lineup of experts from both India as well as Europe. Pritam Banerjee heads the Center for WTO Studies at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. Previously, he was Senior Director for Public Policy with the Deutsche Post DHL Group, responsible for South Asia. engaging with governments and governmental regulations on regulatory affairs and policy. He has also served as head of trade policy for the Confederation of Indian Industry and has worked on trade facilitation with the World Bank and the ADB. Ignacio García Bercero is a senior fellow at Bruegel, following a distinguished career at the European Commission. Among other roles, we just heard from Dr. Weyand that he was involved with the, at the starting point, as it were, of this very FTA. But apart from that, he's also been the chief negotiator for major trade talks such as the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. He is a visiting professor at University College London and has published widely on WTO matters, EU trade policy, and the trade climate interface. Arpita Mukherjee is a professor at ICRIER, where she leads our work on growth, employment, and macroeconomics. She has over 30 years of experience working closely with the government of India and policymakers in the European Commission, the US, and ASEAN. Her areas of expertise include trade, investment, services, sustainable development, and startups, and she has over 80 publications, including in national and international refereed journals. Finally, André Sapir is a senior fellow at Bruegel and professor of economics emeritus at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He previously taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Graduate Institute of International Studies, and the College of Europe. He has been a visiting fellow at the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, and a long-term advisor to the European Commission. He's widely published, and I would single out his recent book, China and the WTO, Why Multilateralism Still Matters, co-authored with Petros Mavroidis, as the single best book that I personally have read on the multilateral trading system. So welcome to the panel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. And let's get to the questions. So Pritam, if I could start with you. I wanted to ask you, what are the main benefits for India from this deal? Contribute to the aim to feel free to be as expansive as you want in that answer. But I wanted to particularly ask you about the potential for labor-intensive industries, like footwear and apparel, where prior to this deal, countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh enjoyed a 10 to 17% tariff advantage over India, and that playing field has now been leveled. I also wanted to quickly mention some calculations done by one of the ICRIER fellows called Soumitra Chatterjee, who looks at countries' unskilled labor endowments and then looks at their share of global manufacturers in low-skilled manufacturing and finds that China exports about 18% more than its endowment would suggest. Vietnam and Bangladesh export at par, and India exports 15% less than its labor endowment would suggest. And that gives us an export opportunity. Just those very crude back of the envelope numbers suggest a $160 billion opportunity for India annually. So please tell us what, in your view, are the main benefits of this deal for India.
Sabine already kind of largely because many of India's competitors already had FTAs with you, or they were enjoying GSP benefits. Therefore, especially in labor-intensive industries, carpets, uh, ready-made garments, textiles, footwear, furniture, made-ups, and all of these areas, there was, depending on the competitor country, we're looking at between 8 to 15% tariff disadvantage that our exporters suffered from. Obviously, with this trade deal, and as was pointed out by Sabine, is front-loaded, so immediately we have, when the agreement goes into force, perhaps within this year, binding tariffs coming down to zero, which brings us to the level playing field, which is great news. Of course, again, and I think you have kind of identified the elephant in the room by saying that China kind of punches much above its weight. So to give you another statistics in a report that we did at our center, if you look at, if you break up global manufacturing into the 66 sectors classified under the ISIC, the standard, the International Standard Industry Classification, out of the 66 sectors, China produces at least 20% or more in 56 of those sectors. That's a massive concentration of production, and that growth goes across labor intensive and what we would call technology intensive sectors as well. So obviously China has a tremendous this is not trade, this is just output, total output, share of output. So that's a different aspect. There's a hyper competitiveness. We can argue the source of that competitiveness is fair or unfair, and all the other debates we can leave that aside. But obviously this agreement is of great interest from that perspective. But it's just not about labor intensive. So because if you look at our last three budgets and and interventions towards competitiveness, I will not call all of these policies as industrial policy per se, but interventions to help competitiveness, then they have been equally spread, uh, focusing on both labor intensive and technology intensive or more capital intensive sectors. And it was very much true for this budget as well. So you have policies, this budget, that targets garments, it targets various parts of the supply chain in furniture, footwear, etc. But there's also a large number of interventions for engineering, for electronics, and of course you have the PLI schemes. And that I think is very interesting, because what Sabine was talking about is that the FTA is not just about market access in goods; it's about value chain integration, especially in the turbulent world that you started out with discussing, Shekhar, with this binding tariff commitment. So when you look at supply chain managers and businesses, what they're really looking for is certainty. 5% or a 7% is of lesser importance than knowing that whatever X percentage it is going to be there, for good. They don't have to constantly rejig their supply chains based on varying tariffs, which is the problem we have today with the US policies. So a binding commitment that ties up these two big economies allows for these value chains to be developed, the supply chains to be invested in, and there, given the demographics that we have in India, the sheer number of absolute number, percentage terms much lower, but absolute number of STEM graduates that we have uh, is, it gives India definitely a good advantage to attract a lot of the tech intensive, engineering intensive investment to come into India. India offers a large growing market, as has been discussed in the media as well, that this year India will contribute 70% of the total global expansion of the GDP. By 2030, that number will be close to about a quarter. So this is a very large growing market, and so India offers both the economies of scale for European firms and the production base as well, something to diversify their supply chains with. So to that extent, we are expecting FDI to be a very important component of the overall story. And that brings us to services, because if you look at the global value chain, the share of services as a share of global trade is increasing. Share of, especially digitally delivered services is increasing very, very fast. And India is one of the global, leading economies in terms of that part of the economy, the global capability centers and all of that. So, and it's integrated into production. A lot of the trade that you see, if you think of a Tesla car, what you're paying, let's say if you pay $100, for a Tesla car, assuming you're paying $60 for the services and only $40 for the car. That's the way the value is working. So it's very, very integrated. So the binding commitments, especially in mode one, or what we call cross-border delivery of services, is a big achievement as well in this agreement. But if I can just take a couple of more minutes to talk on a bigger picture of issue, of course, there's also the TBT. Sorry if I forget that, the technical barriers to trade component of it, where the big challenge, especially for MSME exporters to a market like Europe, which while typically has much lower tariffs, but has huge regulatory requirements and compliance requirements exporters have to meet. To that extent, the TBT agreement is quite ambitious, I would say, because it specifically addresses issues of conformity assessment, which is the cost that exporters pay. So it has a dedicated, committee on conformity assessment to look at these issues. It, promotes international standards on conformity. So all of those are very positive outcomes. But even in areas where typically, and you started out by talking about this, extremely complex, complicated, turbulent world, and how do we make progress in trade policy, especially in a situation where large developing countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil have a certain worldview, and there's a different worldview perhaps that we see from our developed country counterparts. Well, this agreement, I think the biggest achievement for it is that it shows that if there is courage for brave compromise, then things are possible. Uh, as was pointed out by Sabine, that even a year back this seemed difficult, and it seemed difficult because perhaps the courage for brave compromises from both sides were missing. But both sides found that. I don't know to what extent President Trump must be given credit for us finding that courage, but courage was found and the agreement was reached. So for me, the India-EU agreement represents that format whereby large developing countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia will increasingly contribute larger and larger shares of the global GDP, but are also facing the challenge of, if I may say, put it very starkly, both supply and demand side blackmail. And also, what Prime Minister Carney has called middle powers. I hate to, categorize the European Union as a middle power. It's one of the world's largest economies as a whole. But, many Europeans and I'm very glad to say that many Europeans themselves call themselves a middle power in that sense. So, I think there is this possibility of middle powers coming together, whether they are wealthy countries or developing countries, and finding the courage to compromise on issues which seem difficult. And the EU-India FTA provides that template for us to go forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pritam. I love that phrase, finding the courage for brave compromise. I think that's a very accurate way of describing it. And it is indeed interesting to speculate to what extent the American administration is driving some of that courage. And the need for predictability has never been higher, which I think you rightly emphasize. Let me turn now to Ignacio. Ignacio, thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. Can you tell us a little bit, just like Pritam told us about some of the key benefits for India, what are the major benefits for the European side from the FTA? And what is its significance as part of an overall strategy to diversify trade relations and consolidate the network of FTAs in the Indo-Pacific region? Please feel free to be as specific or as broad. But I'd also like to ask you, if you want to give us some color on the sectors. So I would note that currently, if you look at European exports to India, the main sectors are machinery, electrical equipment, and pharmaceuticals. Is it these existing sectors that stand to gain the most, or is it sectors that are being newly opened up? A couple of them are cars and wines. Or do the main benefits perhaps lie in service exports? Please.
Well, thanks a lot, Shekhar, for having me here. And let me start by saying how happy I am that this negotiation has been finally concluded. And my tribute to Sabine Weyand and her team, Christoph Kinner, for having been able to bring this to conclusion. I was involved in this in our first attempt to negotiate an FTA with India, and I'm really very, very happy that it has happened at this point in time. Now, I think that Sabine and Pritam have already given a little bit of the color in terms of sectors. Let me basically refer to the impact of this FTA at 3 levels. Now, the first one is the immediate market access gains for Europe. I think for India, they have already been mentioned. And there are some sectors where India has a very high level of tariff protection. The 2 more emblematic ones are cars and wine, where there will be an immediate market access benefit arising from the quotas, so the tariff rate quota that have been negotiated. So that would be an immediate market access gain. I would also expect that there will be very significant gains in a number of manufacturing sectors where the European Union is very competitive, and where there is going to be also a significant reduction of tariffs, and a lot of this also happening early in the transitional period. So that will be the case for the chemicals, machinery, but also in general, I would say, for many intermediate products. I mean, Sabine referred to car parts, which I think is also a very important sector from that point of view. Now, in my view, however, if one really wants to look into the benefits of this FTA, one really needs to go beyond this more immediate focus and look into what is potentially more transformative of the FTA. And there, I think the key is on foreign direct investment, or investment more generally, not only foreign direct investment. I think one also needs to look into the flows of portfolio investment from the European Union into India. I think it is clear that the big development challenge for India is to increase its role as a global manufacturing power. There's a lot more that can develop in India in that connection, and that will be critical also for job creation in India. And in order for that to happen, foreign direct investment in general, is going to be key. There is going to be, by the way, a very interesting paper to be published in the next few days by another senior fellow in Bruegel, García, together with an Indian researcher, Rajesh Gupta, that would look in more detail about the challenge about how to increase foreign investment and manufacturing in India. And I think, in my view, the India-EU FTA has a huge potential to be transformative in this connection, has a huge potential for European companies in India as much more of a natural destination to generate new investment and to generate new trade flows. I don't think that you can say at this point in time exactly in which sectors, although in my view, if one really wants to go in that direction, one really needs to look very much into what Sabine presented as the unfinished business of this engagement. I think, in my view, there's more work that India and the EU should be doing on investment and looking really into different dimensions. There's the issue of investment market access that normally is part of European Union FTAs, but is not part of this agreement. There's the issue of investment protection, where there is parallel negotiations of an investment protection agreement. There's the whole dimension of investment facilitation, which in my view is as important, if not more important, than investment protection. And there's the whole question about investment promotion support for specific investments. And in my view, all of those issues really should be looked at by both sides and try to be creative and see how to complement the FTA with a new type of a new form of investment agreement or agreement. So that, for me, is one of the very important open business that both sides should now be focusing on. Now, the other area where I see a lot of potential for further development has to do with issues relating to climate cooperation and the greening of the economy. If you look into the FTA, I have to say I would really pay tribute to both sides for being both pragmatic and creative when it comes to issues relating to sustainable development. There's a chapter on sustainable development in the free trade agreement that, in my view, is very robust, very solid. It is not subject to dispute settlement, but I think that's fine, because at the end of the day, the more effective way to deal with those issues is not through litigation, it's much more through cooperation and dialogue. It is the first time that there's an agreement that the European Union has concluded that having a specific annex relating to border carbon measures. And there's also the announcement that, apart from what appears in the FTAs, both sides intend to negotiate a memorandum of understanding on cooperation on climate action. And in my view, all of these things have a real potential to be really transformative and to create a new dynamic of cooperation between India and the European Union in terms of diversification of our dependencies when it comes to the green value chain, in terms of building together those green value chains, and also cooperating with other countries in the region. Because I think, as you mentioned yourself, the European Union has developed a very extensive policy of engagement with countries in the Indo-Pacific. It has concluded FTA with already with 2 members of ASEAN, but quite a few others are going to be also concluded or ratified soon. There are free trade agreements with Japan, with Korea. So I think, in my view, one should also be looking into what is the scope for cooperation between India and the EU in the more broader Indo-Pacific region. So all in all, I see this is a great agreement. I'm really very happy that it has been concluded. But in my view, it's basically a basis on which to build upon. And I hope that both sides are going to be now also looking into the next challenges ahead.
Thank you, Ignacio. I think the focus on investment as part of the unfinished business is very important, and I certainly look forward to reading Alicia's paper. I had forgotten to mention that in addition to the live audience, we also have, I believe, quite a big audience which is joining us online. And so I would encourage anyone joining online, if you have questions for our distinguished panel, please send them with your name and affiliation. And when we come to the Q&A session at the end, we will turn to some of the online questions in addition to questions from the live audience. So now let's turn to Arpita. Arpita, we've heard earlier from Pritam about the main benefits of the deal for India. What are some of the misses from the Indian perspective? What should be in the deal which wasn't? And the other thing I'd like to ask you is that India is also currently signing a flurry of FTAs. What is it that makes this one the mother of all deals? How do you compare it with other FTAs like the India-UK FTA? And what impact will it have on existing FTAs that we have?
Thank you, Shekhar. See, I think the term mother of all deals come from multiple things that we were trying to achieve through this deal. First is that you are talking about 27 the EU member states. You cannot compare an FTA with so many countries together with one country at a time. So this is a vast complicated deal that you are thinking about, with different countries having different interests to be protected from the EU side also for this trade agreement. So it is definitely a complicated trade agreement, and much more complicated on their side to negotiate. The second thing is that it is also called the mother of all deals because it comes at a time when it is setting a stage where both sides have decided to take certain compromise to make things happen. I must say that they have been very, very open about talking to each other in a way that, we have to make it happen. And that is the change in position of India and EU from the previous type of the things which were, if there is no feta cheese, there is no agreement. And if there is dairy, there is no agreement. But Ignacio had gone through those levels, and if there is no basmati rice, there is no agreement. We don't have basmati rice, we have an agreement. So there are many places where we compromised on core export items to the European Union. I just gave the mention of the basmati deal. Second thing is in services. Like if you look at the entire, we are talking about FDI. India's FDI regime is very liberal for manufacturing. It is pretty complicated for services. Now, we want to attract investment. Our regime is really, really complicated for services. And in terms of that, it requires a thorough overall and a kind of cleaning up of the unilateral regime before we kind of sit to discuss. The other problem that we have in our investment regime is much of these investments also have, we have center deciding on certain items, we have state deciding on certain items, and we have joint decisions on certain items. And in areas where we have joint decisions and state deciding, for example, retail is one such area, it is very, very difficult for the center to take a commitment outright. So investment, although we want investment in trade negotiations are not very simple for India to go ahead and do it. And the interesting part of the current European Union agreements are that they also faced a lot of investment related issues in ISDS and cases and clauses and all of that, for which they are very happy to move investment quietly out of their trade agreement. So they initially, when we were there in the first half, no investment, no agreements. From there, they have gone into their own problems, for which they have been very open-minded to do 3 parallel agreements: a trade agreement, an investment agreement, and a GI agreement. Now, In India, most people do not have a clue on the GI agreement. And that's where the real, game is, because in India, the GI product until recently were a mixed basket of product. We have Banarasi sarees and all the GI, which is a handicraft as well, very limited food. Now food is coming into the GI. For the Europeans, food is a major component. Cheese, wine, everything is a big component of the GI. So if a good GI agreement happens, my question is, how do that match with the agreement in trade? Like, you allow GI cheese, you don't allow cheese in trade. I don't know. So there are some places which we really need to think through how the agreement develops, and that is very important of the nitty-gritty of the development of the agreement. There is another thing that I wanted to talk about, is that how the MFN clauses are inbuilt into the trade agreement. For example, the Australian agreement, although it may look narrow and the mini deal, it does have an MFN clause. Now, how do Australia benefit from this agreement is very important for us to see, because India in past did not use MFN clauses in the trade agreement. So for Japan, Korea, etc., Japan and Korea had to renegotiate and reopen the deal. But for Australia, things are much more simpler. I just wanted to give you that. The other thing is government procurement. Government procurement has been a major demand for the both sides. And let me put you, but the products are different. For the Indian IT companies want to have a government procurement access in the Europe, but they also want to bring down the level so that their project size is not very big. So they want to bring down the level so that they can make do with the smaller project size, which is generally the smaller project size are protected under EU directive for the EU member state. That so there is a concern with respect to that. They wanted that. The second thing is, on our part, we also have government procurement, interestingly, in many areas of EU's interest. But you can get a zero duty on wine, but if the states put their duties, you are nowhere. And there are states which do put in differential duty, like Maharashtra, on wine from the foreign wines, on domestic wines. So I don't know how that has been addressed, because we don't see all the schedule of commitments. There are other areas where we need to look into. One is that the entire agreement has kept regulation. While it talks about regulation, it has kept regulatory issues for future discussion. Like if you look at, let's say, services chapter, and you talk about mobility, and you talk about MRAs, and they said that, okay, a joint working committee will be set up, then they will have 1 year to discuss. So 1 year is for the agreement to happen, 1 year for the joint committee to happen. So you think 3 years, nothing is happening like that. You can relax for 2-3 years before anything you can see on ground in terms of this kind of a regulatory thing, which is very open-ended, very unlike the UK agreement, where they have said, okay, in 1 year, this is going to happen, in 2 years, SSF is. So there is a very clear timelines. Here, there is a clear timelines for setting up of committees, regulatory bodies, discussion, but not a clear timeline for actual deliveries out of the regulatory process. So that is, I think, a miss. I think the trade and sustainability development chapter was a bit overranked by India in terms of policy. There is a policy and a practice in India. In terms of policy, our regimes are quite good. We have signed all international agreements. We have also done the occupational code and other things. So we do not have a policy related problem. But in terms of practice, we do have a problem in terms of monitoring, in terms of state adopting these occupational codes, which are pretty new, net zero. These things are happening in India. And how fast we adopt it to meet the requirement of the agreement is something we need to see.
Thank you, Arpita. Those are indeed very important points, including the regulatory timetable. Let me now turn to André. André, welcome. How does the EU-India agreement compare with other FTAs that Europe has been involved with, in particular with the EU-Mercosur FTA? And here I would like to note that despite the sort of celebratory thing that the Mercosur agreement got over the line, it was then promptly sent by the European Parliament to Strasbourg for a judicial opinion. So, was the celebration premature? And what does that imply for this agreement? Is this agreement also likely to pass the remaining barriers in the European process smoothly?
Thank you. Thank you, Shekhar. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted especially that we do have a great agreement between India and the EU, though, as others have said, it's an agreement in working progress, and that will need to be improved. But we have a really solid basis. Now, you're right to make reference to the Mercosur, the EU-Mercosur agreement that was signed just a few days, a few weeks before the India-EU agreement, and to make a reference to that. Let me put that in context. As we all know, the EU has more free trade agreements with more partners in the world than any other WTO member. But what it had until last year was mainly agreement with small or medium-sized developing or emerging economies, or with advanced economies. What is new with EU India, with EU Mercosur, and also with EU Indonesia, is that now the EU has agreement with very large emerging countries with very big markets, but very different also economies from the EU. So for us as economists, we say, well, we are very complementary, and there are lots of comparative advantage benefits to be had, but sometimes also it means some political difficulty. And it's true that in my meetings, including with high-level officials from India in the past 1 year, one of the questions that they were asking me already then, as we were, finishing the negotiation with India and with the Mercosur, I was asked by Indians, is the EU going to go through with the Mercosur agreement? Are we going to really manage to sign it? And then the question became, well, no, it is being signed, and as you said, Shekhar, but are we going to be able to ratify it? And as you know, in the European Union, trade deals, all trade deals, they have to be ratified by two bodies. One is the body that represents the member state, the Council, and the other one is indeed the European Parliament. Now, there's been some opposition, both in the Council and in the European Parliament, to the EU-Mercosur agreement, though clearly there is a majority both in the Council and in the Parliament in favor of the deal. But it's true that the European Parliament has brought the deal for institutional reasons, not so much for content, for institutional reasons. That deal has been brought to the Court of Justice of the European Union, not in Strasbourg, but in Luxembourg, and to rule as to whether the deal is according to EU legislation. Now, presumably that will be the Court of Justice will agree on the deal, but I think behind this legal case, there's clearly politics. And the opposition, some of the opposition that there is in the European Parliament is clearly related to a specificity of Mercosur and the EU-Mercosur agreement. So let me just say a few words of where India and Mercosur are in a sense similar, but also very, very different, and why I do not expect really any difficulty with the EU-India as we have seen difficulty with the EU-Mercosur. Where India and Mercosur are similar is in economic size. Obviously, India is far, far bigger than Mercosur and the Mercosur countries, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. India is far bigger in terms of population, but in terms of GDP, India is not that far bigger than Mercosur. In terms of trade, if you look at goods exports by India, is a little bit less actually to the world. It's a bit less than what Mercosur exports to the world. So in terms of trade, they are not very different. And even in terms of exports to the EU and EU exports to both India and Mercosur, the trade between India and the EU and India and the EU and Mercosur are roughly of the same size. Sabine mentioned 120 billion euro both sides for EU India. Well, for EU Mercosur, it's about 110 billion. So we are talking of something, a relationship which is of the same size, though one would expect because of population and the rapid growth of India, much, much more rapid than Mercosur, that it will increase at a much, much bigger rate. But there is a huge difference between India and Mercosur in terms of its trade with the EU. It's obviously the product composition. 40% of Mercosur exports to the EU are agricultural products, 30% are mineral products, and only 30% is manufactured. And this is completely different, obviously, for India, and that's why all the speakers spoke about value chains and about investment, and rightly so. 70% of India's exports to the EU is manufactured. Agricultural products, which has some political difficulties both in India actually and in the EU, only make up less than 10% of exports from India to the EU. So the bottom line is that because of the difference in product composition, because agriculture is not at the center at all of the relationship between India and the EU as it is between the EU and Mercosur, the bottom line is that I don't expect any problem, neither in the Council nor in the European Union or in the European Parliament with the ratification of the EU-India agreement.
Thank you, André. Completely agree. I think agriculture is the elephant in the room, and I think it's a toss-up whether the EU or India is more protectionist when it comes to agriculture. So, yes, presumably we won't have the same difficulty as the Mercosur deal. We're already at about 4:30, so we're going to do one more round of panel questions. But could I ask participants to keep their answers a little bit briefer so that we can still reserve 15 minutes at the end for Q&A with the audience? So, Pritam, let me come back to you now. We already heard a little bit about this, but maybe you can expand a bit about this unfinished business. So I'd like to ask you about investment, which we've heard about from various panelists, but also about, professional services, future collaboration at the WTO, maybe the implications for people-to-people exchanges of unskilled labor and skilled professionals. What are the implications of this deal for those things?
The paucity of time, and I'll skip the WTO part. That's a complicated mess. But on the other ones, on investment, I fully agree with the previous speakers. That's definitely, that's the other aspect of the binding commitments, right? So if we are going to build this global value chain linkages, investments can come into India, there are certain concerns about the protections, etc., that investments need. As was pointed out by Dr. Mukherjee, there are concerns on both sides in terms of binding their hands. But I think a middle way can be found, and I think it will be found. I think the direction is the right one. In the case of services, and I'll just pick up from where I left off. If you look at the demographics in terms of people below the age of 35 globally who have STEM degrees, Of course, quality might be questioned in some cases, but in absolute numbers, India would have about a quarter to 30% of that for the next 10 to 15 years, which gives it an enormous amount of edge. Globally, services are moving away to a very different, they always have been, but there's something called the global delivery model or GDM for most services, which means contracts are not executed mode wise. That's not the way businesses see how services are delivered. They're delivered across modes. By that, I mean that increasingly, because of digital enablement, you have 70 to 80% of the work being done offshore, in a place like Hyderabad or Bangalore, and this will cover much beyond IT. So, it covers everything from research and development, design, medicine, it's a huge array. Things which was previously thought could not be performed remotely. A lot of those tasks are now possible to be performed remotely. So 70-80% of the work is done offshore. And then you have obviously some need for on-ground presence, and this requires people to go on site for the clients, as well as in large markets you will need an office of the firm delivering the services to coordinate. And of course, in places like financial services, etc., you have a jurisdictional need to be in that country, so the regulator can hold you accountable. So for these reasons, all these modes become important, and all of these modes have been covered in the agreement that we have with the EU. So the larger point I'm trying to make, and I have a small beef to pick with you, please do not conflate the temporary movement of people on the client side to support a business delivery with immigration. I think that's the fundamental problem we have globally, is that this temporary movement is being conflated with immigration, making it very politically difficult for even fair-minded negotiators to come to. And that's another unfinished agenda, as was pointed out by Dr. Mukherjee. So, if I am an Indian firm, I will have 70% of the work being done here. But time to time, I need to have people go to the client site. For that, the visa regime, etc., needs to be facilitative for me. But again, they have huge economies of scale. The global capability centers are coming up in India in a very big way, and it's moving increasingly to the smaller towns. And it is really the fuel for India's next middle class revolution. And I think there's a perfect coincidence of wants, because as EU firms want to grow in services, want to become more competitive in their manufacturing, they will need their services backend. And in fact, if you have seen recent literature coming out of Europe, they have often complained that this backend integration with services is not so good in Europe, which makes their firms less competitive. So there is this complementarity, which I think will drive a lot of that. I'd just like to spend just one more minute on what I think is a very important area where people have kind of ignored, which you pointed out, is this on the low scale, right? So all these visas, they cover the higher scale spectrum. Now over there, typically we don't delve into that in trade agreements for a good reason, because again these tend to be politically difficult, and they are largely, and they should be, demand driven. So you have essential demand in the country that requires that labor, requires that number of workers, and through bilateral standalone labor agreements, supply agreements and other mechanisms, those things should be filled. And we are already seeing a lot of that happen. Individual countries have come to to India, to other places like Philippines, seeking specific skills, whether it's nurses, whether it's people in the construction sector. So those will be demand driven, and demographics will anyway inevitably lead to that demand, and a lot of that demand will be fulfilled from countries like India. So you will see a lot of that happen. Does not necessarily need to happen through trade agreements. Thank you.
Thank you, Pritam. Very interesting. Ignacio, let me go back to you on the WTO. Okay, I want to ask you two questions which are kind of related, but maybe not. One is this deal fully WTO compliant? And then the other is, what are the broader consequences of this deal for the future of the multilateral trading system? And let me preface this with the critique that Jagdish Bhagwati often used to make, Jagdish Bhagwati was a critic of bilateral trade agreements. He thought that bilateral trade agreements, by their very nature, violate the principle of most favored nation status and reduce the pace of multilateral trade agreements. Now, in light of recent events, perhaps it's very naive to be holding a torch for multilateralism. But should we abandon hope of multilateral progress and focus on bilateral deals like this one in the future? I guess another way of putting this question is, do you view bilateral and multilateral trade deals as complements or substitutes? Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Shekhar, because that's a really great question. Let me start with the easiest part of your question. Is the EU in the FTA WTO compatible? The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, of course, there's no such a thing as a clear definition of what WTO compatibility means. Sabine has been referring to how much of trade is actually liberalized on value terms. Normally, you also look into tariff lines liberalization. And my understanding is that both India and the European Union have fully eliminated tariffs in about 90% of tariff lines. And that most people would agree that is a good standard of WTO compatibility. If you are looking into services, almost are being covered, and it is quite comprehensive in terms of sectorial coverage. So again, I don't think that is a question that it is compatible with both Article 24 and Article 5 of GATS. Now, of course, some of the FTAs that the European Union has concluded, including with countries in the region like Indonesia or Vietnam, they have a higher degree of ambition, particularly when it comes to liberalization. But I don't think there's any question that this is an agreement which is compatible with the WTO. I think, however, the much more interesting question is the second one. What does this mean for the global trading system? And I have to say that we need to be conscious that we are facing a situation of an existential threat to the global trading system. I mean, the United States has basically decided to totally act outside of the rules, to ignore even the most fundamental principles of the WTO. And we all know that even if China says that it abides by the rules, there are many imbalances about the Chinese economic system. There's a lot of concerns about the China 2.0 shock in terms of imbalance of their economic growth model. And this is creating huge tensions in the global trading system. I think that the fact that the European Union and India have agreed at this point in time to conclude an ambitious trade agreement is a very good signal, but it should go together with reinforced India-EU cooperation in the multilateral setting. And let me be very clear, we need to understand that, of course, India and the EU have not necessarily always been very like-minded when it comes to discussions in the WTO. And we are really at a moment in time which I think both sides need to go a little bit beyond their doctrines and try to understand how they can better cooperate at this point in time, also at the multilateral level, because quite frankly, if India and the EU on certain issues see much more eye to eye, the impact that it's going to have on the global trading scene is huge. I think the agreement with India from that point in time is not the first time that the European Union concludes an FTA with a country which is a G20 country member of the BRICS. We also have agreements with Brazil. We also have agreement with Indonesia. I think, in my view, India is on a league of its own. So from that point of view, I think the potential for this to have a real impact in terms about discussions about how to try to move the WTO forward from the very deep existential crisis that it is currently experiencing, I think that's something which should really be grasped. And of course, there you need to look into the short term and you need to look into the medium term. Now, in the short term, we have in 2 weeks' time the MC14, the ministerial meeting of the WTO. I think it would be, in my view, extremely bad for the global trading system if this meeting was going to be perceived as a failure, if there was not going to be any progress on the issues about how to move forward the WTO. And let me make one specific plea to India. I hope that India is going to be able to look again into its position relating to the investment facilitation for development agreement. Because I really think that this is an agreement that has a huge degree of support, including by countries in the global south. Ideally, I think it would be good if India could consider joining the agreement. But if this is not politically possible at this point in time, I hope that at least India is going to be ready to leave its objection for the integration of this agreement in the WTO. I think, in my view, that would be a very good political signal that could be given by India at this point in time. Now, this is for the short term. When it comes to the medium term, I think we all know that the most fundamental challenges have to do with issues relating to the level playing field, to what extent the rules that they currently are in the WTO are effective to deal with problems about distortions on competition. And I think, in my view, this is an issue where, in my view, India and the European Union may well have common interests. And I think it would be interesting that both sides begin to reflect upon about what is the best way to tackle these level playing field concerns in the context of the WTO. And finally, let me make a comment that goes a little bit beyond the WTO, and it's just a question about the whole development of trade in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, as you might be aware, the European Union has started a process of dialogue with the CPTPP countries. It is not about the European Union joining CPTPP. That's sometimes misunderstood. That's not the objective. It's about both sides to see how they can cooperate together. Still, it's not very clear exactly how this cooperation is going to be developed, but there are ideas, for instance, about both sides negotiating agreements on certain issues like supply chain resilience, maybe like digital trade. It is still very much open. And quite frankly, I would like to see also a perspective about the possibility of India also becoming the party to some of those discussions, because I tend to think that there will be a lot of value if you try to develop the possibility of seeing how there can be an engagement between the European Union, the CPTPP countries, and some countries which are not in the CPTPP, like Korea and India, but which also have very strong connections with the region. And also will be very important if you actually want to build up jointly value chains which are not too dependent on one particular big country. So I just would like to put that issue for further reflection.
Thank you, Ignacio. Arpita, let me step back a bit and go back to the negotiations. Do you see a change in India and EU's position since the previous round of negotiations, which helped us to kind of put this to bed very quickly after the very long period? I believe that the FTA negotiations started in 2007. So what are these brave compromises that were made in order to get this over the line? And maybe you can also speak in this context of India's position on the CBAM, which I understand has been a sticking point previously, but no longer so.
Agree or not agree to a particular regulatory framework. So product wise, I have already explained that, you know, we respected each other's red lines. For example, certain sectors have not been opened up on the EU side and certain sectors have not been opened up on the Indian side, or there have been quotas to, you know, limit the inflows. So therefore there are product specific respect for each other's red lines. Your second question is much more complex. The series of measures that EU is implementing, some of which is in the name of climate, environmental standards, labor standards, is questioned by many countries in the world, including India, including so-called the US and the administration. Now, it is a part of the measure that the European Union is doing. And to now put it as an annex in the trade deal implies that India is not going to call it illegitimate in the WTO. I think that is the part that is where the European Union have an achievement. So we don't oppose them in terms of it legitimacy. We can work on them on support and how we get the best deal out of a thought process that CBAM is going to stay. So that is the one part of the agreement. Second part of the agreement is there will be differences between the European Union and India on even trivial issues or bigger issues in the WTO. Let me just give you an example. Like if the European Union is talking about public sector enterprises, whether they direct it to the Chinese, we have the second best number of public sector enterprises after the Chinese. So we get bombarded any which way, whether they direct the information to the Chinese. So there will be areas where India would reserve the right to protect itself, and every country who is putting a WTO reform paper does not necessarily agree in toto to the lines and content of the paper. However, there are areas where we can be more open-minded. Probably the area of digital trade. The digital trade chapter of the European Union, UK and others shows that India is very receptive to taking out some of the JSI provisions, and some of them are very good provisions because they are trade facilitation plus it is talking about paperless trade and other. I think those we need to think in, because the last time the MC13 talked about that, there is this working party on e-commerce and digital trade, which is which has also a sunset clause. So if you need to really think about something to protect your digital trade, and if India is going to be a major exporter of services, and services are going to be exported through mode 1, we need to find an avenues to work together with our key market to protect our exports. That's one part. And if that market becomes a broader market under, people will say JSI is not WTO compliant, this is not plurilateral, the working paper on working party on e-commerce should be there, whatever is the format. My logic here will be that it is now the right time for India, with all these FTAs around, to be more aggressive negotiator in the WTO rather than a naysayer. And I think we have reached that stage of India being a very aggressive negotiator, putting forward its yes and no.
Thank you, Arpita. I fully agree with you, by the way, that India should stop being a backbencher when it comes to WTO negotiations and start taking the lead in sort of defining the shape of the next multilateralism. André, let me turn back to you with a variation on the same question, because I know that you have long been skeptical about the economic and political feasibility of an FTA between India and the EU, largely because of India's positions. Could you explain the basis for that skepticism, and what is it that exploded that skepticism finally and allowed us to cross the line?
So I think the short answer as to what has changed, I think can be summarized in 2 words, Trump and China. So let me go back to the reason for my long-held skepticism. By the way, the very first time that I heard the idea of a FTA between the EU and India was in 1992. From the then ambassador of India to Brussels, Arjun Sengupta, who had been sent by India away from his post at the IMF to be in Brussels at the time of the crisis. And one of the ideas already floated then by India through the ambassador was that India should enter into a negotiation with the EU on an FTA. And I told him then, look, this will never happen. And I kept that view for a very, very long time. I would say I kept that view until a year ago. And no, the reason was, I mean, it has been said before, India has been a country with a relatively high level of trade protection. And the impact of that is that, okay, if you do a trade deal with the EU, but you don't do it on a multilateral level, at the same time, it means that some countries will be harmed because they will be disadvantaged in the Indian market. And I thought that it would be impossible politically and economically for India to do a trade deal with the EU, but not with the US. Because the US then would say, our exporters are very disadvantaged in this highly protected Indian market compared to the EU exporters. So I thought that, I mean, what we call trade diversion, right? In economics, that trade diversion would be great for EU exporters, but would be problematic for others and maybe even harmful for India, both economically and politically, especially, as I said, vis-à-vis the US. Now the world has changed, obviously. India has done a deal. I won't say a trade deal, but a deal, as we have done in the EU with the US, under duress from President Trump. And yes, India has done what we have done with the United States, is offer to the United States, outside of the framework of Article 24, outside of MFN, in violation of WTO rules, no doubt, the EU has offered to the US, as India has offered to the US, freer access on a bilateral basis to US exporters. And so in a sense, now that you have also offered free access or freer access to both the EU and the US, we are on the same level in the EU market. So there's no more trade diversion for the US. And therefore, the economic and the political problem of India of doing a deal only with the EU but not with the US, that has gone away. But I would just add, to finish, my other word, which is China. What India is getting into the EU market, where we have already free trade agreement with many countries, but we don't have a free trade agreement with China. So India is getting a better access to the to the EU market than a competitor, China. And we, the EU, we are getting a better access into the Indian market, not than the Americans, since the Americans now are getting, thanks to Trump, the same level of access, but over China. So in a sense, the increased competitiveness of China, both in the Indian market and in the EU market, is giving a reason both to India and to the EU to do a deal, a bilateral deal that leaves out China. So that's why my answer is, before that trade diversion, I think would have been very costly, politically and economically, especially for India, because levels of protection are much higher in India than it is in the EU. But now, in a sense, Trump has forced its way and is getting the same, and India sees an advantage of getting an advantage over China in the EU market, and we see the same into the Indian market.
With your question, can I just, because I comments on the WTO, but all the speakers did, so allow me to put forward a contrarian view. So, first, for a backbencher, we seem to be getting a lot of attention from the teachers. So that's the first point I would like to bring. The second is that if one looks at the US and the EU communication that was done on WTO reform recently, and the more recent UK communication, the EU is politely saying the same things the US is saying, which the EU seems to be very good at. Not being brash and bold, but diplomatic. But they're saying the same thing. They're saying the world has changed. The WTO should cease being a platform for multilateral negotiations, which would, Jagdish Bhagwat, you would hate to hear. That it should be a forum for plurilaterals, not just plurilaterals, mind you. The US clearly says only closed plurilaterals, a club of the willing. EU says maybe both, But close plurilaterals is not a bad idea. You also says for national, and the China thing comes in over here, that keeping all these supply chain resilience, national security, these are legitimate exceptions to the MFN and should be considered. So we are hearing similar statements from the advanced Western economies, and this has really proved the concern that India has had on plurilateral agreements. Why we are being called the backbencher is because we have resisted plurilaterals, not because we are scared of the content in these agreements. In many cases, as Dr. Mukherjee pointed out, we have aggressive interest in those agreements. But we do not want to open the door and set a precedent. Now, my question to all the panelists and everybody sitting over here is that while the rules are very clear on incorporation of Annex 4 closed plurilaterals, it's not so clear about the mandate for negotiations and the mandate for initiation. This is open to debate. So what prevents the WTO reform round this time from coming up together, the whole membership, for those guidelines? And then let the IFD go through those guidelines so that we do not set a wrong precedent for the IFD. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Pritam, and thank you, André. I think we need to organize another panel soon about WTO reform and the role of geopolitics in shaping the future of multilateralism. But for now, we've only got about 5 minutes left. I want to take some questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. From BRICS Institute, I was reading the official.
Can you just give your name and affiliation?
Raj Satru from BRICS Institute. Thank you for this opportunity. I was just reading the government websites for this mother of all tales. The Indian side is claiming that we have got 97% of tariffs eliminated and 99.5% of the total volume. But the European side is just saying 90% of the total tariff and 91% total value. So where is this discrepancy? And the second part of my question is, what role, being the top think tank in India for the trade, what role ICRIER have played during the whole process? Thank you.
Let's just gather a few questions before we turn it over to the panelists. Yes, ma'am? There's
from Institute of Economic Growth. I like this discussion very much, especially both speakers from India. I just wanted to answer a bit to one point you made about temporary visits on work from India. Perhaps we should also look at the misuse sometimes made of these visits and why Indians tend to run away from India. Can we make it more attractive to stay in India? But I have one question. Will all this help our startup economy, which is very important for the future? Thank you.
And let's take two more.
Thank you so much. My name is Akash. I'm from CW. The Indian government denies TRIPS plus data exclusivity obligations, but the IP chapter includes plant variety protection provisions. Given that seed affordability is central to India's food security, how does the EU interpret the implementation of plant variety productions? And does it see this as TRIPS compliant or going beyond? So I have one more question on the fertilizers. Since chemical and fertilizers face tariff elimination for EU exports into India at entry into force, while Indian fertilizer exports to the EU face CBAM, given that India's 1.75 lakh crore fertilizer subsidy architecture, how does the EU assess the competitive impact on India's domestic sector of fertilizers? And is green ammonium production with collaboration with EU going to, through the FTA's provisions, is this going to incentivize the exports that India can make? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have one more question online, which I'm going to read out. This is from Nicholas Kohler Suzuki from the Jacques Delors Institute of Paris. and it is about what hurdles should we anticipate during the ratification process in the EU and India, negative public sentiment against migration, resistance against the Sustainable Development Chapter, sectoral defensive interests, and based on this, what timelines can we expect for ratification in the EU and in India? So a number of questions. Maybe I can ask, maybe I can start with Pritam. Pritam, feel free to answer any or all of these questions, and then I'll take it around the rest of the panel.
Thank you. On the discrepancy between those numbers, it depends on the data that you're looking at and the lines that you're looking at. So the tariff liberalization schedules typically happen at what we call the tariff line, which is the harmonized system level 8, which are not concorded between the two countries. Globally, up to the level 6, the World Customs Organization definitions are concorded, they're identical. But when you get into tariff lines, they are different. So, because of those differences, you will always have some minor percentage of differences in those outcomes. Ma'am, to answer your question, there is, migration that or, movement that takes place, which is not, fully legal or under the radar. A lot of that also takes place globally, and then they are not part of trade agreements. When it comes to this documented movement of temporary workers through these different visa categories, largely limited to skilled labor, India has never had complaints that our workers have either overstayed or broken regulations. It is true that many of them do stay back, including mostly in the United States, where after a certain number of years they're entitled to apply for green card and other mechanisms. But again, let us not conflate what happens in terms of the under the radar movement of some people with this very legal and transparent means of movement of people for work. I am sorry I could not fully understand your question on plant varieties. Maybe we can take it offline and I'll answer that question. Thank you.
Let me ask our colleagues from Brussels if they have any responses to these questions.
Just quickly, just quickly on the issue of ratification. My impression is that ratification of the agreement should not be too controversial in the Council. It would perhaps give a little bit more of discussion in the European Parliament. As Nicolas has indicated, there will be some discussion about the chapter on trade and sustainable development, because it's the first time that the European Union has concluded an agreement in which this chapter is not subject to dispute settlement. So that would attract some degree of discussion in the European Parliament. My own personal view is that despite that, this agreement is going to go through, although the more that India and the EU show that they actually have a clear common interest to cooperate on sustainability issues, the more I think that it would also help in the process of ratification of the Parliament. And that's one of the reasons why I attach a lot of importance to this idea that India and the EU are going to develop an MOU on climate action, which in my view is also important from the point of view of India, because it should be also the way to try to tackle some of the concerns which are still there when it comes to the implementation of the CBAM. So I would tend to think that it would be, in my view, good for support in India, but also good for support in the European Union. If I may just say a very quick word to what Plenang has said on the plurilateral agreements, because it will be a subject of a much bigger discussion. I agree with you that it is certainly good to have a discussion about criteria and guidelines for incorporation of of open MFN agreements. But I hope that should not be a reason to prevent the rapid incorporation of the IFD, because under any possible guidance, this is an agreement that should be incorporated in the WTO. It has 125 WTO members. It is going to be implemented on an MFN basis, and it has a very strong SDT provision. So from that point of view, I really hope that India will be able to show some flexibility on IFD.
Come in, André.
Thank you. I would like to also add a word on the WTO multilateralism and our friend Jagdish Bhagwati. Now, I think for all of us, what we have been witnessing, obviously, in the last few years and few months has been very, very sad. And I think we are at a crucial time about the future of multilateralism and the future of the WTO. And speaking from Brussels, I would say that although, and we heard Sabine obviously repeat that, and rightly so, and the president of the Commission, the Trade Commissioner, always repeating the attachment of Europe to multilateralism and to the WTO. I think we should not underestimate the discussion that is taking place even here in Europe, despite our principal attachment to the rules-based system. There are lots of realist people out there who are saying that we are much too naive, that the US has completely abandoned the rule-based system, that China is only paying lip service to it, and that why should we be the last naive in the game here? And so, despite discussion, as I say, showing attachment to the system, there is a debate. There is a real debate. And I think it is incumbent upon us who believe in the rules-based system, who believe in multilateralism, to be able to show that indeed the system, number one, can be partly reformed while maintaining the major principle. And I think for that, cooperation between India and the EU, I think is important. I think many of the points that the panelists have made about including the EU view and sometimes being sort of double language, I think all of this is correct. And I think it's very good to have that discussion. I think it's very, very important for India to play a major role in the system, not on the sidelines, and to express all of its views, if we could, the EU and India sort of launch initiatives together into how do we see multilateralism and the WTO beyond Trump and beyond those difficulties that we have to take as given. What is our vision? What is our common vision for the future if we really believe in a rules-based system as the best for dealing with international cooperation and issues that obviously we are all faced with, including certainly climate change. So I think I very much agree with Ignacio that the issue of climate, and to link that with trade and in our agreement and beyond that, I think it's absolutely crucial. So trade, climate, and multilateralism, I think, have to be viewed together as one endeavor.
Thank you, André. Arpita, I'm going to leave you with the last word.
So let me answer the question, what does ICRIER do? So let me begin with that. So basically, as a think tank, we have to be very independently evaluating a trade deal or its impact, or how should the country prepare for it. In this particular case, the trade deal, all the schedules of commitment, everything you will be able to see only 1.5 years down the line. So this is very predictive at this stage. At this stage, what you can do is how do you prepare? And that's what ICRIER is doing now. We are working with the farmers, we are working with the MSMEs to identify what they need and how to help them to actually meet the requirements of the European Union broadly in terms of its directives and requirement, and narrowly in terms of the trade deal. So the deal happens or not happens, you you should be able to do your business in the European Union. That's the broader concept that we work on. The second point is that MSMEs, they have a chapter in the trade agreement. MSMEs and startups, when you talk about startups, you talk about IP protection, you talk about the digital trade chapter, talking about source codes and flexibilities in your source code. So there are many areas within the different chapters that cover startups. I would strongly recommend that startups also with the European Union, there are joint startup hubs with the member countries, there are startup to startup discussions. So there are different formats in which startup engagement is happening. Startups who want to do business abroad needs to go through the formats, and then they have to look into it and go forward. My basic answer is that just don't jump into it that the deal has happened and let's me dive without knowing the depth of the water. Please understand that where you need your capacity building, do your homework, come to us to do your homework for you if you cannot do it yourself, and then move ahead to do your trade. And I think it is a very, very good trade deal and you will benefit from it.
Excellent last words.
Thank you all very much. This was a fascinating discussion, and I would really like to thank the audience for tuning in. I thought when we had this that we might run out of things to say. In fact, we've been able to go past 1.5 hours, and I feel that we've barely scratched the surface of what we've got to tackle. And may I also say that, as I said in the beginning, I'm very happy that ICRIER and Bruegel did this together. And perhaps ICRIER and Bruegel cooperating together on this can be a microcosm for what we expect out of the EU-India FTA. Thank you all very much for joining, including our colleagues in Brussels, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Shekhar, and thank you, everybody.